Welcome to the Execution is King podcast, where we talk to successful startup founders, investors, and ecosystem builders to uncover insights and best practices for the next generation of great global startups. I'm Joseph Siebert. Today, my co-host is managing partner at Great North Ventures, Rob Weber. Hey, Rob, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's pretty rocky out there with the ups and downs of the stock market as it relates to tech companies. But, overall, I'm as bullish as ever on the startup space and, the ability to kind of change the future.
Yeah, and the next big thing, at least all the hype on the horizon is Metaverse. That's why I'm so excited for today's episode. We have an expert in the field. This is going to be a great deep dive, longer episode. I'm just really excited to learn a lot more. Rob, why do you think it's important for founders and investors to educate themselves about the metaverse and the opportunity?
I think when you have these big, market-changing technology forces, you can be a casual observer and kind of develop like a fuzzy understanding of what might be possible or what the future might look like. But when you talk to someone who is spending all their days, nights, weekends over many years, really immersing themselves in one of these new technology trend areas, they can bring a lot of clarity and maybe eliminate some of that fuzziness. And I think this is such an important opportunity, not only for founders of startups, but also just anyone in the world, because I do think in the next 10 to 20 years, this sort of movement towards the metaverse or this trend towards the metaverse is going to impact everything, like the internet did in the late 90s or like the iPhone and Android did, and then say 2007. This is one of those kind of mega trends. And I think the opportunity to learn from someone who's so knee deep into it to kind of bring clarity is just a really great opportunity.
Well, let's get started. Today's guest is Tipatat Chennavasin. He's the general manager and co-founder at the Venture Reality Fund, and he invests in VR, AR, AI, and the metaverse. Welcome to the podcast, Tipatat.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
We've known each other for probably about 10 years, Tipatat, but for the benefit of our listeners, can you tell us about your background and what led to you founding the VR Fund?
Sure. So honestly, I've always been in love with gaming and animation and technology. And, I think about the things that have been evolving in my lifetime and, gaming kind of being this brand new thing and then the internet being this brand new thing and kind of wanting to be involved with it and seeing how the world is changing through technology. And especially through entertainment and media and technology. And so I did the .com boom and bust. And then I worked in interactive entertainment and gaming for most of my career. And then when we'd met, I just started, left the company to start my own mobile gaming company. And this was, during the earliest days of mobile gaming. But then it was interesting to kind of see how big that business became so quickly and how the startup opportunity closed pretty quickly for small, early stage startups. And then really thinking about what's next and what are the opportunities that come when there's a huge shift, like the shift from mainframe to desktop computers or desktop computers to internet or desktop computers to mobile computers and smartphones. And so then really it was backing the Oculus on their Kickstarter, really, seeing John Carmack, who, the god of modern video games and 3D graphics, and talking about, oh, hey, VR might finally be a thing. We should check it out. And so I was like, okay, that's worth like $350. Let's check it out. Let's see what it is. And then, got the Kickstarter, played with it. Then it was the next development kit, the DK2, that had positional tracking, playing with it. And again, my experience, my background, I know a little bit of programming and a little bit of art, enough not to make super polished experiences, but enough to be dangerous and, hack together something that could be interesting. And so I started experimenting, playing with different ideas. Like, if you could go anywhere in the world or anywhere in the universe, where would you want to go? And I was like, I really love the Matrix. And I would love to be in the Matrix, not just watch Neo, but be Neo, meet Morpheus, dodge bullets, jump across buildings. I felt like, that would be the coolest experience possible in VR. And so with some friends, built a little simple demo, nights and weekends, just to have some fun and just to see what it would be like to live a movie, and in the process of making the jump program, I accidentally cured myself of my real life fear of heights. And so that was my aha moment of like, wow, this is unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And that the ramifications of it, not just for gaming and entertainment, but how we live, how we work, how we learn, how we heal, that there is going to be so many things that this new computing revolution will enable and enhance. And so that's when I decided to go all in on this, spatial computing, VR, AR technology, see what was possible. I ended up starting, the first incubator that was focused on the VR AR space. And then that gave me a platform to really think about how a venture fund really focused at the forefront of this emerging space could be really valuable. And I was fortunate enough to partner with my partner, Marco Demirez, and we started and launched the Venture Reality Fund, 6 years ago now, to create, the fund that invests in the future of computing and the future of the internet. So VR, AR, AI, and the metaverse.
Have you come across any startups that are teaching people Kung Fu?
Actually, I've seen a couple that do games, and there's a guided Tai Chi application. And I've seen other companies too that are actually, trying to solve phobias and productize that idea of, training people and doing these kinds of activities.
Yeah, not quite the plug-in download of Neo, but it's super interesting.
The Matrix was my favorite movie in college. I literally watched it, I think, 30 or 40 times at least. It's a great movie. Yeah.
It was just so eye-opening. It just did so many things. I mean, it was fun, but the philosophy, the ideas that they brought out at the time, and and what's really interesting too, like back then, right? The internet was just starting up. They still use like dial-up modem sounds in the Matrix, right? And it's just like, but they were really present, and thinking about all these things that would just become huge, huge issues. I don't know. Did you get to see Resurrections, the new Matrix movie?
No.
I think I watched it. I don't, it must not have been that memorable because I think I watched it and I can't really remember. I'll have to go back and check it out.
It's hard to live up to something, when it was that impactful when it came out. I think it has some interesting ideas, but it's just not as fun or exciting as the Matrix was. But the one cool thing that came out of it, I don't know if you got to see this. I don't know if we talked about this yet, but Epic, the makers of Fortnite and the Unreal Engine, their CTO Kim Library was actually one of the on the special effects crew of the Matrix, really close with the Wachowski sisters, and also, so what they did was they released this tech demo of the latest Unreal Engine 5 that's playable on the new consoles, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox X, and it's this recreation of the Matrix world. It's almost like a little teaser of what a Grand Theft Auto could feel like in the Matrix, and it's just unbelievable when you think about that progress of Pac-Man 30 years ago to now. Honestly, the effects, that the visual fidelity that they could do on a $500 piece of hardware is better than the visual effects in the Matrix 2 and 3 movies. Like, it's crazy, and you're just like, wow, we've come such a long way in such a short time. And this idea of virtual worlds being so realistic that you would believe it is not that far away.
So I have this feeling that really the metaverse started with gaming, maybe as far back as even 40 years ago, or I can remember, I don't think I had Atari. My first system was a Sega 8-bit. Maybe my parents had Atari or something. But it felt like to me, we've had the metaverse for a while, but it was in 2D on an 8-bit console or whatever, and it's been evolving. Does it feel that way to you? Because it feels like we're just changing how immersive the experience is. It's, but it's a lot of the same. Seems to be heavily influenced by gaming, right?
Absolutely. I mean, just the idea of virtual worlds, right? Really, gaming has taken it to that next generation. And, with upgraded computer processing, it's not just the visual fidelity, but the interaction fidelity, right? The things that you can do now, but also too, the scale that you can interact with other people, right? I think the thing that separates for me the metaverse from traditional, online games and virtual worlds that we've seen in the past is this idea that it's not just for playing games and leisure activities like gaming, but it'll encompass more hangout leisure activities. This idea of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the idea of the third place, where it's like a public space where you hang out, where your first and second spaces are your family, your home, and then your work or your school. But then the third place where you socialize and congregate, right? It used to be in the past parks or malls, but now we do this more online. And then to have these virtual worlds where it's not just centered around gaming, but this is where you meet your friends, you hang out with your friends, go to concerts, do these other activities. But then the biggest component that makes, to me, the metaverse truly the metaverse is this idea of economic opportunity. And that now people can make a living in the metaverse, building experiences for other people, or even just playing the game and then getting in-world currency, but then being able to translate that into real world money that improves their real life situation, right? And all of the previous little worlds had bits and pieces of this, but to bake it into the system and then to bring it to mass scale, I think that's the opportunity that really the metaverse does. So it's not necessarily saying, hey, this is the first to do it. It's about taking the best of these ideas and then really making it mainstream.
It's interesting when you think about players and games and having an appetite for these more hangout spaces. I mean, you see it in everything from like Twitch, which is like people just hanging out and watching other people play video games, to people going onto these online worlds and like cosplaying NPCs, right? They don't need to be the hero at the center of it anymore. Like they're fine just pretending to be a guard in Whiterun and Skyrim, you know, things like that. You know, I wanted to kind of pick up this thought on the Matrix because, you know, of course the metaverse there, if we call it that, was hiding this dystopian nightmare behind it, right? You know, and that's part of all the hype and the headlines. There's Zuckerberg and the name shift for, you know, Facebook, the creation of the parent company Meta, and the ownership they're trying to do to put their stamp on it. But also that, you know, people have criticized the metaverse and cast it in dystopian terms. So between like this public perception of where we're at now and where we're actually heading, what do you think the world at large is getting wrong? And what do you think we'll be like the most surprised about over the next like 3 years or 10 to 20 years?
I think there's so many different levels or places where, you know, this can go. But I think fundamentally, right, like why I think that the metaverse is so much more interesting than the real world in so many ways is because the metaverse is not resource constrained like the real world. And in the real world, like we know this, right? Like there definitely has and have not. And so many times it's based off, you know, where you were born, you know, who you know within your like little, like the area that you were born or the resources that you have accessible to you in the immediate area that you live. And what we've seen with the 2D internet, you know, the online world is it lowered the barriers to that immensely, but still not enough. Right. There's still so many people. There's still this huge digital divide that's happening. And like fundamentally, right, like we still have to get connectivity, you know, solve some of these fundamental underlying issues. But this idea that now, you know, before the internet, most of the people that made money from the internet were developers, people with CS degrees, right? And now we're kind of seeing a shift. And now there's the creator economy and people that don't have CS degrees, but people that aren't not coding, but people that are designing or creating content or artists, and you know, other people can make money from the internet now, right? And I think the metaverse is a continuation of that idea, an expansion of that idea, where now, you know, the tools, the way to access and live in the metaverse will be much more natural than a keyboard or mouse or even a touchscreen. It'll feel like the real world, right? Like you see a digital item and you just grab it and you know what to do with it. And that's going to lower the barrier of entry for creators, for, you know, people that are developing content in the metaverse, and really democratize this idea that anyone can make money, provide value in the metaverse, right? I love this idea you brought up of, you know, people playing NPCs, right? Well, people should get paid if they're going to play NPCs, right? Like it's almost like, can you imagine an online dinner theater, right? Or like, you know, a dungeon master in D&D controlling all of the different characters in your quest, but then you pay for that experience because it's going to be great, right? It's like, I think that's going to be a new way we're going to think about, you know, what is theater and what is video games. And it's like a merging of the two and creating these brand new experiences that are just going to be amazing and fantastic. And I look forward to that. Like for me, imagination is infinite. And that's the only thing that's constraining the metaverse, right? And that's why, to me, the metaverse world will win, because again, there's going to be infinite opportunity for everyone.
Wow, that's pretty all encompassing. I think you know, the closest I ever had this feeling was like, you know, maybe in the mid 90s when you just had millions upon millions of consumers getting on the internet for the first time, and you had that sort of sense that the same feeling I get hearing you describe, you know, the sort of infinite potential of where we're headed. And when you try to sort this all out, I saw on your LinkedIn profile, you had this really great market map from 2017, kind of categorizing the VR and AR space, I guess. I'm curious if you were to either update this now, How do you break down the different categories of the metaverse in terms of a market map?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I stopped doing it because it started being too complex, right? It was easy to manage when there were like hundreds of companies. Now there are thousands of companies that again met this criteria of like, have they made over 1 million in revenue, or did they get millions in investor money, and what were they working on? And I think the fundamental idea was to kind of show the different applications of these technologies, and that it wasn't just gaming. I think most people, when they think 3D online worlds and VR AR technology, they immediately go to gaming. And while definitely it's one of the biggest opportunities, it's clearly not the only one, right? Like these technologies were developed originally by the military for training and simulation, right? And it's just like all the offshoots of that encompass so many different opportunities. And then I think it's interesting too, like when most people talk about the metaverse, like Zuckerberg and so many others like Tim Sweeney and like Roblox, it's definitely a consumer focused metaverse. But then you also hear Microsoft talking about an enterprise metaverse, right? Or you hear NVIDIA talking about their Omniverse, which is what their take on the enterprise in metaverse. And this idea that just as big as playing and doing these like consumer facing things, right? There's also going to be this huge opportunity for enterprise and B2B applications of online worlds with presence, with people connecting, and still hasn't been cracked yet. But if we can get that experience where virtual meetings, especially collaborative meetings where you're not just like presenting our PowerPoint, but we're actually doing the work together, once those can really be done in a very productive way in the metaverse, then that's going to have huge positive environmental impact, right? And we're seeing this already in like a certain scale with Ford. For car reviews, they used to fly all of their people from all around the world to one location so they can do an in-person review of a car, look at the clay physical sculpt of the car, and they'd have to do this. It would take a long time to get everyone's calendars together, fly everyone out there, give people feedback. But for the past almost 5 years now, they've been doing them virtually, right? They put on the headsets, they can do it, and then they can make changes on the fly, right? And then they put everyone behind the wheel, see what they need to see, adjust the things. And it's just like, okay, like when VR headsets and the VR equipment and the software to create it costs millions of dollars, it makes sense that it should be done for products that are, cost millions of dollars to create. But now as all of that hardware and software gets cheaper and cheaper, then it's going to make sense to design more and more cheaper products in that way too. And I think what's also interesting too is to see like this idea of virtual production, right? Like all of the major Hollywood films right now and TV shows, everything, Mandalorian, Lion King, the Marvel movies, they all use VR, AR tools in the process of making them. And the idea of like visualize the world, let the actors see so they don't have to just imagine everything, and then get the camera crew and the directors really like understanding and getting the right shot. All that kind of stuff we're going to see kind of trickle down into the mainstream, and it's going to be the way that more and more content and games are created. And that's going to be kind of going back into like, what is the killer application of the metaverse? It's creating content for the metaverse, right? And it's kind of weird, but if you kind of think about it for computers too, right? It was like, what was the killer app for the computers, the internet, obviously, right? But why? Well, it was not just for consuming the internet, but also for creating and continuing to develop on the internet, right? You need the computer, and that's why it became essential. And that same way, we're going to see like VR and AR, especially because that's the best way to create 3D content, not just consume content, but but create 3D content. We're going to see it really kind of take off.
There's a lot of opportunity, but with all the chaos, there can be a lot of confusion, right? I mean, we have multiple gigantic companies competing over the new device types. Of course, they got Oculus for Facebook now, Apple, Google, Snap, and others building 3D glasses. Then you've got other platforms for more of the operating system or other layers. Like, I guess you could put Steam in that boat, or maybe the gaming companies come up with their own. Or of course, there's elements of creation in Roblox or Fortnite and their own sort of communities. But when you think about all of this, if you're running a startup, how do you decide which device to target, which platform to launch on first? Do you have any predictions on who the winners will be for some of these platforms? I don't think anyone would believe we're going to have 7 different 3D glasses that end up hitting critical mass to millions of consumers around the world. It's probably going to be a small number, right? Or how do you think about these forces in terms of other form factors beyond what's available today?
if you think historically, like where it's gone from like, desktop computers to now smartphones, I think it'll look a lot more similar to what happened with smartphones, right? I think Apple has really proven the right model, and everyone wants to be like Apple, right? It's like you want to own the hardware, but you also want to own the first party, app store. You get to approve what goes on there and you get your cut. And then you also have some of the best applications like the browser and some of these main fundamental applications, right, that people use, like the messenger and things like that, right? So I think that Apple model is what everyone's eyeing. And, honestly, that's why I think Meta, what very much in that same way, where they're like, they lost out on the mobile phone and, they're always kind of beholden to Apple. And so if anything, right, like Apple's switch of the privacy information and that hurting Meta's quarterly revenue, like you can see what impact it has when you don't own the platform. And so Oculus, buying Oculus, that was their $2 billion bet, which again, small bet for Meta at the time to see, hey, is this the future? Could we be a part of it? And I think, after, the 5 years since that's happened, they have the data. Right. They've seen the usage. They see what other opportunities are out there. And they realize now is the time to really double, triple, quadruple, 10x down on that bet and really try to own this next computing platform and the next internet. Now, can they do it? Will they do it? I mean, honestly, there's a part of me that's like, no one owns the internet today. Right. But at the same time, when you're the most used application on the internet, in a way, you kind of do own a lot of it for a lot of people. Right. And so I think we have to really be cognizant about that fact and think about, okay, and this is also why, of course, Apple's investing, Microsoft's investing, all the major tech companies are investing, but also too, like, don't discount ByteDance, owners of TikTok. They recently bought the Pico, the Oculus equivalent in China. Right. And so Snap and others have been talking about hardware and trying to be that hardware platform player and create a hardware software product. And I think that's the dream, right? Like that's the goal. Now, if you're a startup, honestly, if you're a hardware startup, it's just so hard to do. It's so expensive. Like if Oculus hadn't gotten bought by Meta, would there be this big, could it be successful? No, probably not, right? Like it needs a lot of backing. It needs a lot of money, but also too, it needs that foresight of someone at Zuckerberg to, even when it's a loss, you still have to invest because again, 10 years down the line, you don't want to be caught not being one of the major players in the next ecosystem, right? All that being said, like the way I view it is startups in particular, right? It's all about leveraging other people's big investments and then riding on top of that and saying, okay, you know what? Like make the apps for the next iPhone, right? Like make the apps in VR, leverage the billions of dollars being invested by the Apples and the Metas and the Microsofts of the world, right? And really come up with that great use case, that application that's going to get, millions to, billions of people excited about using this device day to day, right? Like, I think that's the big opportunity.
For me, it's hard to imagine with the advantages of Apple, Google, and maybe to a similar extent, even Microsoft with their reach with developers, that how Facebook could overcome that with their relatively limited reach with developer communities. But of course, they have a head start with Oculus being pretty developed and iterating on that. Where do you see developers hanging out now? And I guess, do you really feel like this is going to work for Meta? And when Apple comes out with their 3D glasses, are we going to forget about Oculus? It just seems like Apple especially is just so dominant for developers that it's almost insurmountable. It feels like even with starting well behind where the Oculus is already at.
I mean, I think that's the play though, right? Like these shifts are the opportunity for that to happen, right? Remember before the iPhone, right? Everyone's like, wow, Microsoft is a dominating computer OS. They are in the best position to create a, pocket computer device, right? And what's interesting is, like Apple really took that opportunity and really flipped the script, right? And really, succeeded where others had failed before. And what I will say too, though, is today's Apple the same Apple that did that? No. Not saying that Apple can't do it, can't pull it off, but it's not a sure thing like, it was, right? Like Tim Cook is amazing, but he is not Steve Jobs, right? And in terms of like that Apple of today is not that, like, they haven't really launched a significant new platform, right? Like the smartwatch, the Apple Watch, great product, but it's not a platform. There's not millions of developers making money off of that ecosystem. Now, that being said, do I think, like, I don't discount, Apple and their ability to do something significant, but at the same time, I would say too, like, Facebook or Meta, sorry, has put in the work, right? Like 10 billion a year. That's more than Google would dare spend on this. Like you see Google abandoning projects left and right, right? So I think the fact that Meta has built an ecosystem where there's $1 billion spent in the App Store. There's over 100 developers making over $1 million in revenue, and top developers making hundreds of $millions of revenue. I think that they've done a good job of proving that this can be a thing. But at the same time, you're right. It's still early. It's still anyone's game, right? It is that thing like they could be the Palm or the Handspring, right? And it could be, an Apple, or, it could be someone else, right? And I think that's what's exciting. But if you're a developer right now and you want to play in this space, like you definitely have to pay attention to, like you have to develop on the Meta platform or think about playing. There's of course a PC VR ecosystem that uses Steam, but that form factor is very limited. That price point is very limited. And then of course, I would also say, PlayStation VR and PlayStation VR 2 with Sony is going to be amazing, but that's really game centric and consumer centric. So a lot of enterprise stuff are not available on that. And so right now, for better or worse, Meta is still probably the best platform. But again, like, you start off as a PC developer, then you become a Mac developer. You go where the platforms are. And I don't see it fundamentally changing from the form factor. And so I don't think it'll be too different developing for an Apple, mixed reality device than it was developing for a Meta.
Technically, are most of the AR and VR projects still using kind of these 3D engines that came out of the gaming space primarily, like Unity and Epic and so forth? Yep. And I guess those are cross-platform. So it would seem then this portability across these, if there ends up emerging a couple of, 2 or 3 major hardware devices, that it'll be easier for the developers, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, we talked about some of these big shifts and thinking back to a few, it's kind of like divided between software and hardware. Like Yahoo, Google came along and it was search, right? And then later on, another big shift was social. And I think about that, like, that was ways of accessing this information that weren't hardware. It was like software, right? So then we talk about form factors when everybody is talking about virtual reality and AR. People are obviously fixated on headsets and, Google Glass and all that. And people are more fixed on that hardware being kind of like that catalyst for that big shift to happen. From what you've seen, if you had to bet on one, what do you think will be driving that big shift? A piece of software and a change in paradigm shift there, or the right piece of hardware?
I mean, honestly, it's tough. It's like both of them are important, and both of them will, and huge improvements in both will lead to brand new, huger, bigger opportunities, right? Like you'd say, like the internet. Before smartphones, the internet was still huge. It was still a great opportunity, right? Like when it was just connected desktop computers and laptops. But when it got the better form factor of a smartphone and their apps, and web 2 was created, and it was much more easier with a better interface, that changed the game and made the internet everything, right? And so in that same way, I kind of feel like Metaverse will be the same way, or thing where with a PC and a desktop or a game console or a mobile device, you can connect to the Metaverse today and you still get a pretty good experience. But man, when it's in a very light, comfortable VR, AR system, and not just what you see, but also the interaction and how you touch and how you move in the world and how you play those experiences, that's when, oh my gosh, it's going to be billions of people and truly will be the dream fulfilled.
Speaking of the tactile stuff and things you touch, have you ever destroyed anything or hurt yourself or somebody using one of those VR headsets?
That's so funny. So fortunately, I have not. Although I just today saw an article where it was like home insurance claims had jumped up 30%, and they're attributing a lot of that to VR and the rise in popularity in the VR. This is from The Guardian, so like a reputable news source. But I found that hilarious. Where I mean, you definitely have to watch out. Ceiling fans and TVs. I mean, you see pictures on Reddit all the time about these things happening. But I'm very good and very lucky to have enough space, and a dedicated space to use for my VR AR activities.
Yeah, that's the exact article I was talking about. It said it was like 650 pounds was the average amount of damage, which is like $883. And all I can picture is those little kid videos whipping the Wii controller around and straight into the screen, you know?
So speaking of Wii controllers, I know you've invested in, several of the real breakout consumer VR entertainment apps, ranging from Beat Games, which Meta acquired, Rec Room, and so forth. If you think about, the trends impacting, in particular, VR gaming, I guess look at AR gaming with the success of like Pokemon Go. I thought Pokemon Go was dead, by the way. My 10 and 12-year-old boys, they're like playing it more than they ever did. I don't know if they had some update that came out, but when you see the games that are really influencing the culture, what are they doing, or what are the trends that are really catching on right now?
So it's really interesting. Like, again, I kind of would unwind it back to like the history of games isn't about so much about the display. It's not necessarily about the TV, but it's about the input, right? The joysticks, right? Like, it was a bigger jump from, going to a digital pad and a couple buttons to having the dual analog sticks, right? Than it was going from a regular CRT to a HD TV, right? In terms of like the experiences, the types of experiences that you're going to do. And so in that same way, you have to really think about that for VR, where sure, everyone looks at the headset and like, oh my gosh, the immersion, you feel like you're there. But then it's those gesture controls, that one-to-one, delivering on the promise of the Wii, right? Like when you saw with the Wii and they had the cute bowling game, you're like, oh my God, this is amazing to actually do the thing. But then it's like the tech was kind of clunky. And then when the people try to make like a sword fighting game or something, it kind of like fell apart. But then with these true gesture controls, all of that now is possible. And then seeing it in a real 3D world and being fully immersed in it makes it all that much more compelling. And so I think it's like people that are really getting it start with a VR first game concept and VR first interaction design. And they're not just trying to create, hey, the VR version of this popular PC game. They're really creating their own lane or their own avenue, or they're taking more cues from physical games, like the things that you do in the real world with real gestures, than they are thinking about what buttons are they pressing, right? And so that's why, Beat Saber, I think, did it the best and has the most success. They did that combination of, easy to pick up, hard to master, but there's no button presses except for to select the menu. Like, you're swinging and it's all about control. And then they also realized too, how to make the movements feel good. Like, I feel like that understanding of, okay, you don't want to just, do one motion over and over like the Wii and spam it. And you really want to encourage people to move in a way that makes their bodies feel good. Right. I think that's something that I never would have thought of, initially when you're thinking about a video game. But now it really makes a difference. And I think Beat Saber, of the myriad of things they did right, that to me has helped with the longevity and why it didn't just become a cool flash in the pan kind of thing and is still the most popular game in VR.
I was thinking about, because we sold our business, which is kind of ad tech for the mobile gaming space, really back, I don't know, it was about 5 years ago. And I remember at that time, I spent a lot of time with game publishers and developers around the world. And it seemed to be this common understanding that Unity as a game engine was sort of surpassing Epic as a game engine on the 3D side, because they were less fixated on just having the absolute best graphics in the games from their engine, but making it more approachable and easier to develop games. And I don't know if this is true or not. I'm not a developer. I guess it kind of stuck with me that it's more of that experience that matters the most.
Yeah. I mean, I think fundamentally, like when you're talking about a game, it's the interactivity that makes it different,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like and this is the thing for VR, I always try to stress, it's not about the visual fidelity, it's about the interaction fidelity and making sure that it's rich and unending, right? Like, that's what you really want. And that's typically those types of experiences do better. But that's not to say that visuals aren't important, and you can't, underestimate how impactful it can be when done right. But just saying, especially when you're a small startup and you only have so much budget to spend, it's like I would put much more on the interaction side. One thing that's really cool though, or that's really impressive, is just to see, like the quality of games in both engines, right? Where you're just like, wow. And especially, like running on mobile phone hardware, or like, even like basic, the Quest type hardware. And you're like, wow, you're getting really cool, really amazing experiences on pretty inexpensive, hardware. It's cool.
I don't really go out to discover new games that much anymore. I'm like a typical suburban dad, but there's like still a couple games from 5 years ago when we were in the game space. Like there's this little numbers game called Merge that Zynga publishes, and it like gets me in this Zen state. I'm so addicted to it, and I don't know why. And it's not the visual stunningness. It's like rearranging dominoes. It has that kind of a feel. But I play it over and over again. I usually listen to a podcast, and then I just play this super simple game from Zynga. And I don't know why. 5 years later, I'm still playing it. I can't explain it. There's something about the interaction pattern that it's doing something to my brain. And I don't know. I've started to read some research on just some of the neurosciences around gaming. Have you read this book, The Gamer's Brain, from, I think it was Celia Hoden?
Okay, I need to check it out.
She was director of UX at Epic, working on Fortnite, but she's a neuroscientist. But it goes from like the neuroscience, and then it gives you practical UX design. It's pretty cool seeing like a neuroscience kind of view. She's been thinking a lot about the brain and how it relates to gaming.
What you're describing, and again, I could be putting words in your mouth, so let me know what you think. But like for me too, like when I play games, and you get like this level of mastery of the game that almost you get into like a second state of it, and it's flow state. Right? It's this experience of like your brain kind of goes on autopilot and you just start doing really, really well. And it's almost like a meditative trance, but it's super nice to get into, right? It's like, it's interesting. Like you'll talk to like pianists or musicians, right? With like when they're really in the flow state, they feel like they meld with what they're doing. And when you're playing a video game too, you can get that same kind of sense. And I get the most in Beat Saber. I don't know if you actually played it or like play it and get to that level where you can start doing like expert difficulty. And it's funny, I'll see blocks and my brain can't process it, but my body responds and then I do it. And it's weird. It's like, I didn't think I was going to do it. Subconsciously, something switched. They're controlling my body, but it's that flow state and that like things happening on that subconscious. And it's very satisfying, right? It's such a great feeling.
Yeah, I played games since I was probably like 5 years old, and now I'm 42. So there are like I don't like to play newer games with my kids because I'm never going to get to that flow state. I think you like very eloquently put it. For me, I like to get my kids, into like the 90s games where I'm like, it's just like it's like muscle memory. It's like it feels so good to play those games, and maybe that's a factor of also just getting older, where I know you have the brain, you have a tendency to learn more slowly. No, I think you can address that by, there's certainly ways to kind of try to maintain an ability to keep learning. But I think the natural tendency is you're going to learn at a slower pace as you age, right?
Yeah. Going back to what we were talking about before, if you haven't yet, play Half-Life Alyx on a VR. You need a high-end gaming PC to play it, but you can actually stream it wirelessly to your Quest headset, or if you have the PC VR headset. But that is like playing a game from 10 years in the future. Like it's AAA quality visuals, but with a full rich experience and like the interactions that you're doing. It's so good. And it's funny, I have a bunch of friends that are gamers, love gaming, love VR, and they're like, oh, have you played Half-Life Alyx? What do you think? And they're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing, but I couldn't play it because it was too scary. I had to stop. And it was like the immersion was too good and they couldn't overcome it. But it was just like, wow, like it definitely is that, like, as someone that grew up, playing Pac-Man, playing Atari and all that kind of stuff, you're just like, wow, this is the future. Like this is the masterwork of what video games are becoming. And you're like, it's the Citizen Kane, I think. Like I feel like
I keep thinking about, though, with compute paradigm shifts, I mean, usually there's the thing that happens, I think, where things really get to, like, I keep thinking about when do we get to 1 billion people wearing an Oculus-like headset? So I had the Oculus, right when it came out, I think probably maybe a little after when you bought it, probably. I got the wired one. It was expensive. You had to have a really nice computer. And then like 2 years later, my kids stopped playing it, by the way. They were just like, oh, whatever. So it sat there. And then all of a sudden their friends got the Quest 2 for like a quarter of the cost, that you don't need a PC. And you go, wow, okay, you can see this. If the cost keeps dropping, is that what gets us to 1 billion devices on 1 billion different humans? How do we get to that? And when does that happen? Could this happen in the next 2 or 3 years, or is this ever going to happen?
So the way I think about it is less about the technology and more about the function it provides, right, in your life. And we can say, like, okay, we know video game consoles, right? Like devices that people buy just to play video games. That's about hundreds of millions of devices, right? Like the top selling, gaming console 100 million, 200 million, right? Now, if it becomes not just an entertainment device, but a productivity device like a desktop or a laptop computer, then that's like a billion to 2 billion devices, right? But now, if it becomes a communication device, something that you need to connect with other people, that's when you get into like smartphone territory, and then everyone needs that, and that's when you get into like the 7 billion, 10 billion devices, more devices than people on the planet, right? Because you have to have a work phone and a personal phone. but that is how I think about it. And then you're like, okay, can VR, AR become these things, right? And it's like I will say very clearly, like, I think Oculus has proven that we're past the tipping point. It can be a gaming device. So I think going from 10 million now to 100 million, possible, right? Not guaranteed, but possible, right? It's very suitable. Like, I think the bigger risk was going to 0 to 10 million was much harder to prove, right? Now, can it go from entertainment device to productivity device? And like we talked about, like, some of these use applications that we've seen, to me, point to yes, absolutely, right? Now, can it become a communication device, something that we'll want with us all day, every day? And I think AR could do that, right? Like, I think there are some, ideas and applications of AR that could make it happen. Now, I think the problem that we're getting to is, like, to make all of that happen too, there has to be fundamental improvements in form factor and technology and hardware technology that enables these use cases, right? And we aren't quite there yet, but I think it's very clear, like it's no longer a leap of faith to imagine that. And I think that we're seeing these technologies less so probably on the optic side, like to get like AR glasses that give you the full field of view but still feel like regular glasses. There's still some physics we have to conquer, but for so many of the other things that we have to do, like to have high quality visuals, well, with 5G we can stream from the cloud. It will be low latency, and that will make at least let the computing hardware and the battery life work a little bit better, right? Like, so I think there are so many things that's definitely on the roadmap, and I think within our lifetimes we're going to see it. We're going to see hundreds of millions of people using these devices daily. Will we get to billions? I think it'll be, once we get to 100 million, then it's a straight shot to a billion. And like I said too, the driver of that will be the metaverse and creating content for the metaverse, right? If building 3D worlds was as easy as playing with Legos, everyone could do it, right? If it didn't feel like CAD, if you didn't have to go to a gaming school or design school for like 2 years to learn how to 3D model and level design, like how to use Unreal, but instead you just got a Lego set and you just put it together and you could rearrange it, right? Like, yes, and VR AR will make it feel like that, right?
If it was as easy as capturing a photo for Instagram or creating a TikTok video, then we would have we would have so many creators. It would pull the whole market, right? Yeah,
exactly. Like, we'll have new 3D sensing technology. We'll also have AI. So when you take a picture, now it could be a 3D game character, and, is that possible today? No. But are the startups working on that? And is it within, 5 years horizon? Probably, right?
All right, Joseph, I'm out of the venture business. I'm going to go launch a VR startup. I'm sold. Anyway, you have a lot of clarity that I think, where there's a lot of us thinking about this, but I think you're thinking very deeply about it. So really appreciate you joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, I'm sitting here just thinking about taking my general iPhone and using the LiDAR on the back to scan myself. Do you think there's much of a market yet for, like immersive podcast experiences where you just are standing behind the guy talking for like half an hour?
Not yet, but there will be. But imagine too, not only will you see that, but what you say will be created as graphics in the real world that you could play with and interact with. And so it'll be like a real-time infographic as well, right? Like AI will understand what you're saying and then give you the visuals to go with what you're saying to make it more impactful, right?
That'll be fantastic. I like to ask all of our guests who come on here, title of the podcast, Execution is King. You've got such depth of knowledge, and as an investor, you really have a great picture of, what's going on currently in the AR, VR, AI, metaverse market. So right now, who do you see executing Maybe it's a startup, maybe it's an individual, maybe it's someone flying under the radar, maybe it's somebody everybody knows, like Google, right? But who do you really see performing?
It's a great question. And I think you're absolutely right. Like ideas are a dime a dozen. It's all about the execution. And I think more so, especially in the XR metaverse and the Web3 spaces, right? And especially when they all kind of converge. And so then I really want to highlight a company that we had just invested in called Jadu. So they create AR NFTs and, a lot of buzzwords, a lot of, stuff going on there. But what's really interesting is it goes back to the execution. It's not about the ideas. A lot of people have similar-ish ideas, but the fact is, like, they had raised money, they had tech, and they were an AR holographic startup working with like celebrities to create holograms, like volumetric captured little videos that you could view on their phone. And then they realized, the NFT opportunity was happening, and one of the things that they realized, people were buying these, profile pictures, NFTs, and then they were wanting to interact with, different metaverse worlds, right? And what they really cared about, this idea of like, well, NFTs, not just as a profile picture, not just as an art collectible, but what if it had use? What if it was a utilitarian NFT? What if you could actually buy something and then use it in these different virtual worlds? And instead of just thinking about this idea and trying to pitch people, they just built it and sold virtual hoverboards and jetpacks, and did over 4 million in sales on an NFT drop for these virtual goods that they could visualize in AR and that they could people could try out in different virtual world platforms. And because they proved it out, then investors doubled down and wanted to invest in them, right? It wasn't like they came to us and said, hey, we have this idea for something, invest in us. They're like, no, they executed. They're like, okay, we have this idea. It doesn't cost a lot of money to make these things nowadays. We're just going to do it, try it. And when it succeeded, investors lined up to want to really double down. And so they did a $7 million raise. And I think it's funny. I meet so many people that are, and I love that they encompass a couple of things. They did a pivot. They went into an even crazier space, from AR, which was very early, into this crazy NFT space. But through execution, they proved that, they could stand out from the crowd of people that are just sitting there talking about it.
Well, this is fantastic having you on the podcast, Tipatat. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed this conversation. And I look forward to being back on after, Rob, you either played Half-Life Alyx or have decided to start your own VR startup. Okay.
Yeah, sounds great. Awesome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.